Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to session 12050, Arctic Ocean Climate and Climate Change. My name is Will Perry. I'm from Bedford Institute of Oceanography. I'll be co-chairing this session with my colleague, Jen-Shao Long. And so I want to begin right now. The first presentation is by, do you pronounce Tanya Weiss-Gibbons? I hope I said it correctly.
Close.
Close. I'm confused a little by the spelling. From University of Alberta with Paul Myers, Tracia Stanek, and Andrew Tefts. You have 15 minutes. We'll stop you a minute or two before the end to allow questions. Please go ahead, Tanya.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Taya. I'm, as Will said, I'm from the University of Alberta. I'm a second-year master's student there, and I'll be presenting on my research, which is looking at the impact of runoff forcing on ocean model simulations in the Pan-Arctic region. So Arctic freshwater in the Arctic Ocean is very important for many processes. This is because the Arctic Ocean is a salinity-dominated ocean, meaning that its stratification is determined by salinity as opposed to temperature in many of the world's oceans. So changes in freshwater inputs into the Arctic Ocean can affect many things. And river runoff is one of the very important sources of freshwater for the Arctic Ocean. It's also one which has seen a lot of recent changes with climate change. It's been increasing a lot in recent years. This trend, which is expected to continue into the future. So we're getting a lot more fresh water from river runoff in the Arctic coming in future years. So we want to look at what impacts can this have on the Arctic Ocean using ocean model simulations. So for this, we used a 1/4 degree resolution configuration of the NEMO ocean model for the Arctic and Northern Hemisphere Atlantic. So this is ANA 4. So this is our model resolution and domain here on the right. And for this, we ran this model 4 times using 2 different runoff forcing data sets and also 2 different atmospheric forcing data sets. So we want to look at when we change this river runoff forcing, what impacts do we see in the model? And we want to be able to separate that out from the impacts of the atmospheric forcing. So that's why we use 2 different atmospheric forcing data sets as well with it. So for the runoff forcing, we use 2 different runoff products. So we used an older runoff product from Dye and Trenberth. So this is a climatological based runoff product. It uses estimates, so observational estimates of 925 major global rivers to make this data set. And it only extends up to 2007. So it is an older data set. And so it doesn't include a lot of recent changes we've seen. So after 2007, when we ran our model, we just reused that year. So basically the rivers were stuck in that 2007 state for most of the time series. And it's not specific to the Arctic Ocean's data set, it's a global data set. And this is important because it is a climatological based runoff data set. The observations of rivers in the Arctic are maybe less than they are in other places of the world. So it has a little bit of less of a accuracy in the Arctic Ocean when it doesn't include a lot of smaller rivers up there or ungauged rivers at that time, that kind of thing. So compared with this, we used a new runoff data set, which was produced by the University of Calgary from the Hydrological Modeling Analysis Lab there, where they used they made a runoff estimates using running the HYPE hydrological model for the Arctic drainage basin. So this model was run specifically for the Arctic. It includes changes we've seen with climate change, as well as impacts of human regulation of rivers in this data set. And it extends up to present day. So it's a more recent data set. So we want to look at the differences between them and what impacts this has. So we can look at the runoff products just as their amounts going into the model. So if we look at the total runoff here in the top here, we can see that the HYPE runoff, which is the blue, and then the Dye and Trenberth is the yellow. It's around double-ish over the entire Arctic for amount of river runoff, but this is not uniformly true. So we have in some regions lots more runoff from in some regions actually more runoff from Dye and Trendworth. And specifically, we see this in this kind of eastern part of the Arctic. We see a higher runoff from Dye and Trendworth, but we see a lot higher runoff from Hype in the Canadian Arctic Archipelago and Hudson Bay region, where we see quite a lot more runoff in the Hype data set. So this is an interesting look at you're not changing the runoff uniformly. It's not a linear increase. It's a very regional increase. And then what are the impacts from these certain regions when you make these changes? So we can look at here, this is the difference in the freshwater content between the pairs of model runs with the different atmospheric forcing. So this is over the entire time period, the average freshwater content in the top 200 meters, with the red being there was a higher freshwater content in the Dye and Trendworth model run, and then the blue being there was a higher freshwater content in the Hype model run. So we can see a similar pattern between the different atmospheric forcing sets over the whole time period, where we have a little bit of that higher freshwater content in the more off that eastern shelf and in the Canadian Basin and the Dye and Trendworth model runs. But overall, it's generally higher freshwater content in the Hype model runs. And we can see specifically, we see that really strong, that higher freshwater content in the Canadian Arctic Archipelago. So we can focus a little bit on that region in particular if we look at the time series of it. So we can see here, this is the freshwater content over our entire model time series. So we have the red and green as the Hype model runs, and the yellow and blue are the Dye and Trendworth model runs. So we see a lot higher freshwater content in the Canadian Arctic Archipelago and the Hype model runs, which is very much in line with what we were looking at before with the runoff added into this region. So this can cause a lot of impacts in the region, especially it can affect a lot of biological and chemical processes like primary productivity and carbon dioxide uptake. But we're going to focus a little bit on the effects of this freshwater as it propagates into lower latitudes, because the Canadian Arctic Archipelago is one of the major gateways out of the Arctic. So we can look at where does this freshwater go and what happens to it. So we see this increase in freshwater transport outside of Davis Strait from the Hype model runs in line with these increases in the CAA. So we see not just the mean freshwater transport is increased in the Hype model runs. We also see this when we have those negative southward pulses of fresh water coming out of Davis Strait. We see them enhanced in the Hype model runs. So we see an enhancement of this freshwater export. And this increased freshwater seems to collect in the Labrador Current a lot. So we see again the two different pairs of runoff of model runs. We see higher freshwater content in the Labrador Current and in the Labrador shelves, and the Hype model runs in line with these increases that we see out of Davis Strait. So this is to be expected from the circulation that we know in the Labrador Sea. So we've seen in other modeling studies that this pathway for freshwater transport from Davis Strait to the Labrador shelves is the common pathway that we've seen before. It makes sense with the circulation in the region. As we get this freshwater coming out of Davis Strait, it gets collected in this area. But notably, we also see an increase in freshwater content in the Labrador Sea towards the end of the time series. So we see this actually in all model runs. So we see starting in around 2013 or so, we start to see the freshwater content in Labrador Sea increasing. But starting in around 2015, 2016, we see a split of where we get the Hype model runs can see even more of an increase in freshwater content in the Labrador Sea as opposed to the Dye and Trendworth model runs. So this is part of another event where we see this increase, but when we have this event, we see it enhanced in the Hype model runs when we have this enhancement of freshwater coming out of Davis Strait from the Canadian Arctic Archipelago. So this is part of the salinity anomaly that we see and that has been observed and that was observed in the subpolar North Atlantic. So this is for 2016. So we take the average salinity in the region, and then for a specific year, we can calculate the salinity anomaly. So if we have a higher or lower salinity, then the average in the region would be our salinity anomaly. So when we have blue, that means it's fresher than normal. When it's red, it's saltier than normal. So we have our observed salinity anomaly. So in 2016, there was observed a large salinity anomaly in the subpolar North Atlantic and the subpolar gyre, which we replicate in the model in both sets of model runs. So this is for just one atmospheric forcing. We see it as well in the other one. And we can, but notably, while we see the salinity anomaly in all, we see an enhancement of it in the HYPE model runs. So when we have other factors which lead to these large scale freshening events, they're enhanced when we've had this extra freshwater transport and export out of the Arctic. So in conclusion then, so the freshwater affects many processes in the Arctic Ocean, and climate change is increasing freshwater sources into the Arctic, especially from river runoff. So when comparing model runs with two different river runoff data sets, we see large freshwater content changes throughout the Canadian Arctic Archipelago, which propagate further downstream. We see a freshening of the Labrador shelves, and we see enhancement of the salinity anomaly in the subpolar North Atlantic. So this shows the importance of the Canadian Arctic Archipelago as a source of freshwater in large-scale freshening events, which we've observed in the past and also can expect to continue into the future with climate change. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation. We're open for a couple of questions. Yo-Yo has one. Would you like to speak up?
Oh, yes, a question in the chat. So, you have two products for runoff. And so I guess the Swedish one is a relatively new one. So when they document their product, do you see why they're different from the dam chamber? And do you have any explanation why they're different?
Yeah, so this is that was using the Swedish model, but it was done by the University of Calgary. So this is Tricia Stadnick's work. So she has a paper, I think, from last year documenting a lot of those differences as well, which I can put in the chat after.
Well, I guess my question is, anybody explain why there's this big difference between different data source or different method, and why?
Yeah, it's a completely different. Here, I can go.
I guess if there's difference or not, certainly there are difference.
Like it's a completely different method of constructing it. So the Dine Trendbirth is climatological based, so it takes like observations and puts them on a grid to come up with estimates, like an average estimates of river runoff. Whereas the HYPE one is using is actually a hydrological model. So it's taking atmospheric forcing over a drainage basin and then like simulating river catchments and holdings and human effects on rivers to come up with an estimate then for river output. So constructed completely differently, which is part of what leads to those changes, because you're in Dine Trendbirth, you're relying on observations you have and as opposed to other people rely on atmospheric products.
David, you have a question?
Yeah, hopefully a quick one. The river runoff is going to increase with climate change. And I'm just wondering, is that going to carry on for a while? Are we going to drain all the glaciers and the multi-year ice, and then that's going to drop off? Or is this predicted to be the same case for tens or hundreds of years?
I mean, it's predicted to be the case for a while, partially because of sources of it. Like part of the increase in river runoff would come from permafrost melt, which there's quite a lot of permafrost to melt. Also, there's increased precipitation expected over the catchment area of these rivers. So that can also contribute to the increase in runoff. For things I've seen looking at, up to 2100, we expect to see these changes. I don't know beyond that, but yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
We do have a cancellation near the end of the session, so I propose that you save your questions for the second last presentation, which is canceled, and we have some time for discussion now. I'd like to move on to Benjamin's presentation. Benjamin, could you load your presentation, please?
Yes, absolutely. Tell me if you see it. Is that okay? You all see it?
Looks good.
Great. So thank you. Hello, everyone, and bonjour à tous. So I'm very happy to be presenting this work here. It's work conducted during my PhD under the supervision of Eric Oliver and with collaborations with Katja Fennell and Chan-Min Hu. And so we're looking at trying to look at the response of the upper Arctic Ocean to marine heat waves for regionally differing ice ocean regimes. And before diving into marine heat waves, I'd like to maybe refresh a bit your memory about what happened in summer 2020 in Siberia. I'm sure you heard about it because it made quite a few headlines. I've just taken a few here as an example, but there was this massive atmospheric heat wave over Siberia, which led to record temperature above 38 degrees north of the Arctic Circle, a lot of wildfires, peat fires. And this atmospheric heat wave was deemed to be 600 times more likely due to climate change, basically. And so climate change will lead to more of those intense heat waves. And so we can expect those atmospheric heat waves to translate into potentially marine heat waves. But there's a difference in the Arctic Ocean compared to the rest of the global ocean, which is the sea ice. And if you take a drink in summer or in a nice day as we have today in Halifax, you put some ice cube in it. Those ice cubes are not only meant to cool down your drink, it's also meant to prevent it from warming up. It will absorb the heat and melt instead of warming the liquid phase. And so sea ice will act similarly as a buffer. And by doing so, it's likely to change the processes associated with the marine heat waves. So we're trying to understand those processes and see how they change. And so to do that, we use a numerical model, 3D model, ice ocean. The ocean component is based on NIMO 3.6. The ice component is based on LIM 3. And we're covering the North Atlantic, North Pacific, and the Arctic with a 1/4 degree horizontal resolution and 75 vertical levels, including 10 in the first 10 meters. And this is important to have a high resolution at the surface because the mixed layer in the Arctic can be extremely shallow in summer, as I'm sure most of you know. So we are forcing this model with ERA 5 reanalysis data from 2014 to 2021, so 8 years, and we have daily outputs. And with those, we can try to understand and maybe look at a couple of questions. So the first one is, how would sea ice influence marine heat waves? And then we can reverse a little bit this question and try to understand how marine heat wave could potentially change the ice phenology and seasonality, and whether it will delay formation or increase ice melt. And so to dive a little bit more into the methodology, the way we look at marine heat waves in this study is by doing a heat budget. And we've actually done a 2-layer heat budget. So we're focusing on the mixed layer, the surface layer. And this mixed layer is of course, time varying. The depth is time varying. And so we first do a heat budget in this layer. And so the temperature tendency, the dT over dt, is equal to the sum of the contributions of lateral advection, surface fluxes, which has to be weighted average between ice-covered parts of the grid cell or the area of interest and open water areas. And then the last term is whatever is coming from below, so this interface flux. And the model doesn't give us all the outputs necessary to properly constrain this interface flux, properly calculate it. So the way we circumvent this issue is by doing a similar budget in the rest of the water column, so the bottom layer, And in this bottom layer, we just have temperature tendency and lateral advection that we can calculate, and the residual basically can be attributed to this interface flux. And by doing so, we can inject this interface flux in the surface layer and therefore close our heat budget. Okay, so that's the tool we're using, and now we can try to investigate specific events. And so the first one I will show you is actually the Siberian heat wave, which was an atmospheric heat wave, but satellite observations have shown that there was anomalies in sea surface temperature, and we also see it in our model. And so to look specifically at this event, we're focusing here in the Nansen Basin on this little box, which is basically halfway between the North Pole and the Siberian shore. And so the model does resolve my heat wave in there, and so we can look at the specific event using the properties and the model basically. And so this plot is quite dense, it's quite heavy, so I'll try to lead you step by step through it. Don't be scared. So the x-axis here is time. We're going from May to December 2020. The top panel, the first panel, is showing you some ice properties. So in blue, you have the ice concentration or ice fraction. And in orange, which is whose y-axis is on the right-hand side, you have the freezing melting flux. So when this flux is negative, it means the ice is melting. And so the ice goes from 1, so full concentration, full cover, in May, down to 0 in end of July. And so that's when the ice is melting. We have a negative rate. Then for a couple of months, we have no ice at all. So nothing happens for the freezing melting rate. And then early October, we're jumping quite quickly from no ice to full ice cover with a positive rate. The second panel shows you the mixed layer depth, just to give you an idea of how thick the layer of interest is. And so the seasonality of that in the Arctic, and in this case, is that we have a fairly thick, fairly deep mixed layer in spring, in winter and spring, so over 40 meters. And then very quickly, once the ice starts to melt, the mixed layer shows due to ice meltwater. And so we're going down to 10 meters for a few months. And then starting mid-August or end of August, some wind mixing entrains some deeper waters. And so that's when we're basically increasing the mixed layer slowly until ice starts to form again. And then due to some brine drainage, we keep increasing the mixed layer depth again. The third panel shows you the way we detect marine heat waves. And so we use for that the definition from Upday and colleagues 2016, which defines a marine heat wave as being the time when the temperature exceeds a specific threshold, which is the 90th percentile, for more than 5 consecutive days. So what you see in this panel in blue is the climatology of the temperature in the mixed layer. In green, this is a threshold, so the 90th percentile. And in black, you have the mixed layer temperature time series. And so you can see that starting in mid-July, we go above the threshold. And so that's the beginning of the heat wave. And we stay above the threshold for 2 months and a half until beginning of October. And then we go below the threshold again. And so the heat wave stops at that point. I'd like you to notice the fact that the heat wave starts basically when the ice concentration goes very close to 0. And that makes sense, right? If you have no ice anymore, you can have more direct atmospheric forcing to the mixed layer, and so you can warm up faster. But the time when the temperature actually starts to go, like to divert from the climatology, is a bit earlier than that. It's actually when the mixed layer reaches its shallowest. And that also makes sense. If you have a very shallow mixed layer, you don't have as much volume to heat, and so you can start to heat faster. So you have this combined effect of less ice and shallow mixed layer that will lead to a stronger amplitude in the warming up of your water. Now to look a little bit more into the processes, that's where the heat budget is coming from. And so that's this last panel. The blue line is the dt over dt, so the tendency. And if you integrate this blue line, you retrieve the black line from the third panel. The green line here is the surface flux, so whatever is coming from the atmosphere, basically. And And you can see that this is really what is driving the tendency. When the surface flux is positive, the tendency is positive. When it goes below zero, when it gets negative, the tendency becomes negative. So we can say that this marine heat wave is mostly atmospherically driven. The orange line is the advection, and you can see it stays pretty close to zero all summer long. So it's not playing a big role here. The red line is the interface flux. So basically what is coming from the bottom. And this one is negative for a big part. So it tends to send heat from the mixed layer into the deeper layers. And I'd like you just to pay attention to this one event here towards the end of August, where we have a strong negative peak of this interface flux, which is followed by the tendency as well. And this is due to some wind mixing, which starts to entrain a little bit the deeper waters. And that leads to cooling, quite rapid cooling that we can see here in the mixed layer temperature. It's not enough to go below the threshold, so to stop the heat wave, but it's quite significant. So in this case, wind mixing will tend to cool down your mixed layer. Now I'd like to show you another event, which is the year before, so 2019, in another area in this Northwind ridge here. So we are located in the Western Canadian Arctic, and we're on the pathway basically of Pacific waters coming through Bering Strait, flowing across the Chukchi Shelf, warming up usually during the summer of the Chukchi Shelf, and then flowing into the Beaufort Gyre through the Northwind ridge. And so same plot as before, you have the same 4 panels. The ice concentration here doesn't reach zero anymore, so we always have a little bit of ice. The mixed layer follows a fairly similar pattern, going very shallow for some of the summer and then increasing again. And the marine heat waves are a bit different. Our temperature goes above and below the threshold several times, and so we have 3 distinct marine heat waves in this case. If we look at the heat budgets and what explains those 3 different heat waves, you can see that the surface flux is important at the beginning and at the onset maybe of the first heat wave, but not so much for the 2 other ones. It's always negative for the 2 other heat waves. And so those 2 other heat waves are rather driven by advection, the orange line, which tends to show that we're advecting water from the Chukchi Shelf into the Beaufort Gyre. And so that's what is really driving this second marine heat wave. There's the other term, this red line, which is the interface flux, so the bottom flux. And here you can see again that it's positive for most of the 2 latest heat waves.
2 minutes.
Good, thanks. I'm nearly finished. I'd like you to pay specific attention, for example, to this event here where we have a peak again collocated with a deepening of the mixed layer. So once again, wind mixing events. But this case, we're not decreasing the temperature, we're increasing it. And that is due to the fact that in this specific part of the Arctic Ocean, we have a near surface temperature maximum, which is located below the mixed layer. And so when we're entraining deeper water, we're actually warming up the surface. And so here we have really the opposite effect compared to the previous event, where wind events might actually increase or prolong a marine heat wave. So to try to summarize that a little bit, if the ice melts, we will tend to show the mixed layer, and that could allow for more concentrated heat fluxes, basically, and so warming up faster the surface ocean. And that is specific to those events, to the ice melt regime. But also, if we don't have ice anymore, if we're melting the ice, we allow for more wind mixing. And the influence of this wind mixing will depend at the geographical location in the Arctic. You might entrain either colder water or warmer water. And so the influence on marine heat waves will depend on that, basically. And so I'll stop here. I'll just leave that summary slide here. We're still working on the other opposite question of how marine heat waves will change ice formation and melt, and into also consolidating, sorry, a little bit the statistical aspects of those results. Thank you, and I hope I have a little bit of time for questions.
1 minute. But like I said before, the sixth presentation by Mary Wong has been withdrawn. So if you have more work you want to show Benjamin a little bit later, just stand by. Does anyone have one question right now? If not, we'll go on to the next presentation. And if you think of questions in place of Mary Wong's presentation later in the session, you can bring them to Benjamin at that time. Would that be okay? Okay, so I would ask Yarisbel Garcia Quintana, and I apologize for probably not pronouncing your name correctly. Would you please?
No, that was correct. No worries. I'm just gonna put my presentation.
Please go ahead.
So I hope you guys can see my presentation, right? Okay.
Yeah, yes,
So yeah.
it's good.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yarisbel Garcia Quintana. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. And before starting with my presentations, I would like to address the collaboration of my supervisors, Paul Myers and Kent Moore. So before jumping into the results, I would like just to address some of the facts, well, mostly the motivation behind of this research project. And I would just mention a few of the facts about Nansen Strait, which is basically one of the main pathways that connects the Arctic Ocean with the North Atlantic Basin. It's located between Ellesmere Island and Greenland. And through the strait, fresh water and sea ice flows out of the Arctic Ocean, mostly during summer. The rest of the year, however, the ice arches that form at the northern and southern ends of the strait prevent this from happening. An interesting fact is that the oldest and thickest sea ice that it can be found that in the Arctic Ocean can be found to the north of Nansen Strait. And as the result, the formation of these ice arches, they contribute to the cessation of the transport of this important ice class out of the Arctic Ocean. However, in a recent study, Moore et al. 2021, they found that the duration of the ice arches has decreased over the past 20 years, while the ice area and volume fluxes along Nansen Strait have both increased. So one of the findings as well is that the stability of these ice arches is a function of the thickness of the ice on the Arctic, but as well as along Nansen Strait. As such, with the ongoing global warming, sea ice thinning may actually have a negative impact on the stability of these arches, and these will potentially result in the acceleration of the sea ice loss, particularly the loss of multi-year sea ice out of the Arctic. And this will have, of course, impact with the ecosystems of the northward Polynya, but also those ecosystems around the last ice area. Now, given the significance of the region, it's imperative that we understand the changes the sea ice is going through along Nansen Strait. So in order for us to explore into this, we use a regional configuration of the NEMO model, and Tay already mentioned this a little bit. So this is a configuration known as ANA. However, I use ANA 12. 12 stands for the horizontal resolution is 1/12 of a degree, and this is around 4 kilometers along Nansen Strait. The configuration has 50 vertical levels. It has open boundaries along Bering Strait, and at 20 degrees south, we have every 5 days average output from 2002 to 2019. Initial conditions and open boundary conditions are from GLORIS 2 version 3, which is a reanalysis product. It has atmospheric forcing that comes from a Canadian Meteorological Center's Global Deterministic Prediction System reforecast. It has a really nice temporal resolution. And we also have river runoff and Greenland loss in this simulation. I'll be happy to address any other questions that you have with respect to the configuration, but for now, I would like to jump into some of the preliminary results. So this figure here compares sea ice concentration, the solar fluxes at the surface of the ocean, and the surface temperature. Now, this is only for cannot remove this little bar. So this is only for the region north of Kane Basin. So it's only the northern part of the strait. But I would like you to focus mainly on the last 3 years within this time series, the years 2017, 18, and 2019. And what we're seeing here is a sharp increase in the amount of heat that is being absorbed by the ocean. And as the response, we are also seeing an increase in the sea surface temperature. It's almost 2 times with respect to its climatology. And at least for the last 2 summers in 2018 and 2019, the sea ice concentration has reached a minimum north of Kane Basin. When we looked into the south of the strait within Kane Basin, this one here is Kane Basin on the little map on the top, we see a similar pattern. However, it's a little bit more pronounced. So the increase in the amount of heat that is being absorbed by the ocean is larger compared to that what we see in the northern part, and as well the increase in the sea surface temperature, which is almost over 2 degrees almost every of these summers, and the sea ice concentration reaches a minimum as well. Now, when we looked into the climatology of these same fields, sea ice concentration, the solar fluxes, and the sea surface temperature for north on top and south below, we see some similarities as well as some difference. For example, north of Kane Basin, what we see is that as the heat fluxes reached a maximum, the sea ice concentration decreases. And only after the sea ice concentration decreases is that we see that increase in the sea surface temperature. So a decrease in the sea ice concentration allows for more of this heat being absorbed by the ocean. However, south of the strait within Kane Basin, we see something different. So we see that after the heat fluxes, they peak, the sea ice concentration hasn't reached a minimum when the sea surface temperature is already maximum. So this kind of hints towards the thickness of that ice being playing a role, allowing some of the heat going through the ice while they're still present, and that we see further warming. So we take a closer look for those years. So this is actually the climatology from 2017 to 2019. We see that they have along the entire strait, there's a similar behavior. So just as the heat fluxes, they reach a maximum, the sea ice concentration decreases, and this is actually allows a further increase in the sea surface temperature. So this is like no surprise here, because we see like quite a warming along the strait. So one of the things that I mentioned previously is that by having some of these, by having the sea surface temperature reaching a maximum while there's still some ice, this might hint that it's the thickness of the sea ice that might be playing a role. So here I compare sea ice thickness with the actual fraction of heat that goes through the ice into the surface of the ocean for both regions north and south of the strait. So here in the northern part, for example, we see that happening. So we see that the amount of heat that is being transported through the ice into the surface of the ocean actually increased as the sea ice thickness reaching a minimum. We see this happening mainly in 2018 and 19, not as much in 2018, and might be because sea ice thickness is still on average on that summer is around 1 meter. However, within Kane Basin, as the panel below, while the sea ice thickness is mainly open water, we see like it keeps as it decreases the sea ice thickness, we see that the transfer of heat through the ice into the ocean actually increases, and then it's not only increasing the sea surface temperature, but also it might potentially be enhancing sea ice melting. Now, looking into the annual average of the temperature over the depth, and I'm only showing here the first 50 meters for both regions, north on the left and south on the right. So similar to what I showed before, that the year 2017 is not as warm due to the sea ice being still thick. I mean, thicker compared to the south. We see here that those years 2018 and 19, they stand out. Like we see that warming at the surface of the ocean. However, within Kane Basin, we see that is from 2017 to 2019, all those years, the 3 years within this time period is like an enhanced warming. And again, it's like the sea ice thickness being basically reach open water allows all this heat to reach the surface of the ocean. And not a surprise, this warming appears to be followed by a freshening. So our theory here is that all the heating or the warming at the surface of the ocean during the years from 2017 to 2019 is causing an enhanced melting along that strait, and is, well, as a consequence, we're seeing a freshening of the surface of the ocean as well. And we see, I think that in this case, in the northern part, the year 2019 is kind of hidden, but it's kind of fresher compared to previous years. And we see the same happening in the southern part of the strait. So I think that, yes, I will go to some of the preliminary conclusions that we have reached so far. So the model data actually shows that the sea ice concentration along that strait have reached a minimum every summer from 2017 to 2019. This minimum sea ice concentration, together with an enhanced sea ice thinning, has caused an increase in the solar heat penetration through the sea ice into the upper water column. As a consequence, the model output shows an unprecedented ocean surface warming with a summer temperature 2 times larger compared to their climatology. And we also see a surface freshening that occurs within the same time period from 2017 to 2019. And this is potentially linked to the enhanced sea ice melting due to all this surface warming that we're seeing within that time. So I think that with this, I conclude my presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. A very pleasant, very interesting presentation. We have time for a couple of questions. Does anyone have anything? Don't see anything in the chat. I think you started the presentation. You mentioned there might be a connection to Northwater Polynia. Did I remember that correctly?
Well, yes. The thing is, like, what I meant by mentioning the Northwater Polynia is like the formation of the ice arches, they have a direct impact on the formation of the ice water polynya. So it might the cessation of these arches, like we don't have arches, so you will have a constant flow of sea ice through the strait even during winter. So this is what poses a threat to the Northwater Polynia, and as well to the last ice area, because it will drain not only like young sea ice, but also like this thick multi-year sea ice that is stored, so to speak, north of Nares Strait. So yeah, so the plan is to to look into the how is the sea ice fields behaving along Nares Strait, because they could potentially impact on the formation or not of the ice arches.
Yes. Okay, does anyone else have a question?
I think that Bruce.
May I ask a question? Thanks for a really nice talk here as well.
Thank you,
the one thing I had difficulty following was that plot you had near the end where you were looking at freshening. It didn't seem to be a clear pattern to me that as in recent years, it's getting fresher and fresher. It's kind of all over the place. Can you explain?
Yeah, I know. So yeah, so maybe this one was not the best one to show the freshening. So it's actually, you can see it on you can see it better on the time series. I was trying to follow the pattern with the previous one that showed like nicely the temperature increase. So you do see when you look into the time series that you have a decrease in the salinity, mostly in that first layer. But it is true that this plot might not actually show them, because they're kind of like but you do see a different from previous years that there's the decrease in the salinity. And I haven't actually still, like I'm still working on this, but our theory is that all this freshening that we see, like suddenly it's just dips, the salinity is due to the melting, because most of this warming is happening at the surface. So it's this, the surface layers, the ones that are in contact with the sea ice, is the one that has the potential to cause melting or yeah, mostly sea ice melting.
I think I follow you. I guess in the end, it's the heat flux can penetrate deeper into the ocean just from solar radiation, whereas the fresh water is floating right near the top grid point or something like that.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that the increase in the fresh water is due to the melting that has been caused. So you have the heat, the surface of the ocean gets warm, and it keeps melting more sea ice. And then as a consequence, the salinity increase. So clearly this plot was not the best one, but we do see that when we looked into the time series. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Aristelle. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Bruce.
So I don't see any other questions. As I said before, there's a cancellation later, so there's time for further discussion. At this time, we move to a poster presentation by Zhensha Long, my co-chair in this session. Zhensha, are you there? Can you present your poster?
Okay. Okay. How to load my
Can you share your screen?
share my screen?
Ada, do you have any suggestions here for the poster?
What format is the poster?
Is a PowerPoint.
PowerPoint? Okay.
Yeah.
At the bottom of the Zoom screen, there should be a
Yeah.
green button that
Yeah.
says share screen.
I don't know. I cannot do it. So
At the bottom of the screen, there's a green button for share screen.
yeah.
You see it? Move the cursor towards the bottom and it will come up.
No, it doesn't work. So I don't know what happens.
I can send. You can email it to me, and I can
Okay, I
try
can
to
send
share.
it to you. Yeah. Okay. So where did you have my PowerPoint? Can you just load it for me?
Yes, after I find it.
So okay.
Okay, I'll try and do this. Does that show the poster?
No, I don't see anything. So I don't know what happened.
You have your screen shared, Will?
I did. I'll try again.
Oh,
Okay, there it is. Do you see it now?
Yeah.
okay.
Um,
This is probably from me, I think. So,
yes. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So This study will focus on the decadal variation of the ocean temperature and the salinity in the eastern Beaufort Sea. So we set up ice ocean model NEMO 3.6 in the Arctic Ocean. So to simulate the ocean temperature and the salinity. So the horizontal resolution is a quarter degree, and it has 50 vertical levels. We ran the model from 1958 to 2019. The atmospheric surface forcing is JRA 55. The lateral boundary condition for ocean temperature and the salinity is from PIGC data. And Glorious currents provide lateral boundary condition for currents. If we compare to observations, the model can reproduce the ocean temperature and the salinity. So AB is ocean temperature. If we look at the ocean temperature, we can see in the Arctic Ocean, it's a 3-layer system. So near the surface, the water temperature is very cold because it's covered by sea ice. Near the bottom, the water is also cold. In between, it's called Atlantic water layer. The water is relatively warm. Compared to observations, you can see the model can reproduce. This is a 3-layer system, but a little bit of estimates the vertical extent of the Atlantic water layer. So this is a vertical profile along this line. This is a Western Arctic. This is the Bering Sea. So the model compared to observation, we can see the model a little bit underestimates the ocean temperature in the Bering Sea. If we look at the ocean salinity, we can see in the Western Arctic, the water is relatively fresh because the buffer GI can transport the surface fresh water to the Beaufort Sea and maintain a freshwater reservoir in Western Arctic. The model can also reproduce this kind of pattern, but a little bit overestimates the Atlantic water in the Bering Sea. So next I will show a little bit about the ocean salinity in Eastern Arctic, Eastern Beaufort Sea in this small area. So we can see for the Eastern Beaufort Sea, the sea surface salinity is dominated by the river runoff from the Mackenzie River. The salinity, the water near the Canadian Archipelago is relatively salty. From 1970 to 2019, we can see that this is freshwater pathway slowly move westward. At the same time, the water near Canadian Archipelago, near Victoria Island, becoming saltier from 1970 to 2019. The average salinity of this area shows significant decadal variation, but we can also see the significant increase in the salinity from 1980 to 2019. For the ocean, the sea surface temperature is dominated by the warming, by coastal water warming. If we look at climatologically, the water near coastal area is relatively warm. This annual average sea surface temperature. But from 1970 to 2019, this warming area slowly expand into the central the central polar sea, suggests the Arctic, suggests the water in that area is warming. This warming is related to the increased accelerated open water, the ice melting in this area. So the increase of open water because of the increase of open water, the ocean can receive more heat flux from the air. So this is why the water near coastal area is becoming warmer in the last 3 decades. So now we try to understand why there is a change in this freshwater pathway. So in the Western Arctic, there is an anticyclonic circulation called buffer jar. It can transport the surface fresh water into the buffer sea through the Ekman convergence. But in the last 3 decades, we can see the buffer jar become much stronger, in particularly during last decades. So the intensified buffer jar can increase the freshwater transport into the Western Arctic through the Ekman convergence and cause the change in the freshwater pathway in the eastern buffer sea. That's why the water near the Canadian archipelago become saltier in recent decades. So as a conclusion, we can say the model can reproduce the basically vertical structure of ocean temperature and the salinity in the pan-Arctic Ocean. And the salinity near Canadian archipelago tends to increase in last several decades. And there's a change in the freshwater pathway. And the change in the freshwater pathway is mainly associated with the intensify and the buffer jar in last several decades. So that's my poster.
Okay, we can take time for one question. Does anyone have any question? If not, we can have further discussion after the next presentation when we have an empty space. And suppose that we're a little bit late. I propose we move on to the next presentation at this time, which is Mara Neuder. Did I say your name correctly?
Yes.
Put up your presentation.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Okay.
Looks good. Go ahead, please.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Monroe. I'm speaking this afternoon on behalf of CMOS, the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System, which normally is observations, but we're going to tie it in with some modeling data. So tangential to other talks within this session, but potentially of interest to those making comparisons between models and observations. As I said, I'm doing this on behalf and the capacity as the chair of a task team on CMOS. And so first thing is, what is CMOS? What is an OOS? It's an example of an ocean observing system. And so the idea and the concept is we've got lots of observations being made all around the world by ship, by boat, by mooring, by buoy, and that data is collected, and we want some way of finding it and making it discoverable. So across the globe, various organizations called OOSes gather this data together and make it discoverable. In Canada, about 3-4 years ago, we founded what was called CMOS as a Canadian sort of version of this, so that when you're looking for oceanographic data, you knew where to go to find it. Now, the thing about oceanographic data is we've gone that transition from data being scarce to data being plenty, right? Back in the day, an oceanographic measurement required a ship, required a mechanical instrument. Data was hard to get. Data was hard to share. You needed to know who who to talk to get the data. We're now in a different era. We're in a era we've got autonomous vehicles collecting data, satellite sensors, high frequency autonomous systems. We actually have more data than we know what to do with. So the challenge now becomes, how do I discover the data in the mountain of data that's out there? How do I find the data that I need? How do I ensure that we're not collecting the wrong data twice? But more specifically, how do I actually find the data that I need? So when we're designing CMOS, our mission is to try and create partnerships and grow this online platform to generate information and knowledge and place-based solutions to advance our understanding of the ocean. That's very broad and sort of high level, but in practice, what we want to do is make ocean data fair. That is, we want you to be able to find oceanographic data, so we call it findable. Not all data is open, so can we make data available through some sort of access agreement? We want to make sure it's accessible. It's fine to know that the data exists, but you've got to be able to download it, get it, send it in the right file format for whatever you need to use it for. Interoperable, we want to make sure that data can be compared to data collected by other USAs around the world, and we want that data to be reusable. Data is expensive. It takes time, it takes energy. We want to have data have life longer than the period of time of just when you first collected it for that first study. So CMOS, as I said, is only about 4 years old, 2017, 2018. And so what it is really a consortium of several different regional associations. So within CMOS, we've got CMOS Pacific, SLGO, CMOS Atlantic, representing different regions within Canada. And one day we may have something that represents the Great Lakes, and I know people are discussing the Arctic, but the idea is these regional associations, each which have partners which might collect data, have federated themselves together under CMOS to come up with some standards, both for look and feel, infrastructure, data standards, so that when you're looking for data, it doesn't really matter who owns the data. Those who access the data are able to find it all together. Now, the development of CMOS, as I said, comes relatively late to the global party. We're able to build upon our partners down in the States, IUS, for example, and takes the best principles from them. So IUS itself is made up of many different regional associations. And so CMOS is a best of breed implementation of an US, and we interact a lot with these other groups. Okay, so what is CMOS and what would you do with it? Well, the idea here is there is data that's being collected. It's out there. It's being held by research centers, industries, municipalities, scientists, universities. And what CMOS is doing or does is basically thinks about the standards for hosting that data, discovering that data, makes catalogs and other web services to discover it, provides an infrastructure to be able to download it, which is key because it's great if you know the person to email to find some data. But if you don't know the personal contact, how do you go about discovering this data? And so we create databases to be able to make access to it. And then, of course, the real value is to create end products, data products, visualization tools. And so there's this pattern. Now, CMOS doesn't itself collect new data, but it's trying to facilitate and augment the overall structure of data collection. Now, why am I talking about this in a primarily modeling group? We've just released or rolled out our strategic plan late last year. And so for the next 5 years, CMOS is going to engage in a number of initiatives. Primarily, it's just increasing the scope and the number of data sets we have, making them more discoverable and accessible. We're going to develop more data products to be able that use those processes. But I want to draw your attention to theme number 4. One of the things we've decided to branch into is to increase the ability to understand current states and predict future states of Canada's oceans by supporting modeling efforts and sharing ocean model results. And I think this is where this might be interesting to some people in this session. So historically, CMOS has focused in its early stages on measurements or data in the sense of done by an instrument, but we know that a lot of the use of model data is to inform, to validate, and to structure numerical models or other kinds of models, and also to validate them and create data products that integrate those model programs. And so I'm here to basically talk about a relatively new task team within CMOS. We call the Model Data Task Team, and I'm one of the co-chairs. And our purpose as a task team is to facilitate the integration of model data so that it becomes findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so the idea here is to gather a bunch of people together who are thinking about how to integrate ocean model data with observational data in a consistent sort of way, provide some opinions, provide a forum for discussion. How do we link this up? Coordinate or envision what a CU's big data program might be, because of course observational data, when you're talking about moorings and buoys, are relatively small. Model data can be quite large. I should address what I mean by model data, right? So when we're thinking about model data within the task team, we're thinking about models in the sense of climate models, hydrodynamic models, biogeochemical, statistical models, Lagrangian drift models, basically any kind of ocean model which relates to a place and a time that in principle could be compared to an observation. That's under the umbrella at this particular stage. Now, what's not included is the model's codes themselves. We don't have the capacity, we're not set up to talk about model codes or configurations as things. We're looking at the output of those models or models as data. Though there are groups and other organizations who are talking about reproducibility and reusability of models, and that's another discussion, but doesn't fall under what we're doing. One of the questions that's been asked of our task team is, will CUs be in the business of hosting model data? Ooh, that's a need, right? The world, our community needs ways of exchanging model data. Some of these data products can be quite large with each other. We're not really in that business. We're not an archive. Now, CUS actually isn't an archive for observations either. But what we're trying to do is standardize the way we describe the data so the data can be reused, to encourage model data to be reusable, findable, and accessible. Where needed, if there's a data product, we could host maybe a subset of that data or an advertisement of that data, or just provide pointers to other places where that data might be located. So what are we doing in terms of those modeling efforts? We're not running models. We don't have that capacity. Modeling groups would be running that modeling. But what we're doing is we want to support that modeling. What does that mean? It means if you're running a model and you want to compare it to an observation, say for validation or some prediction comparison, we want CUs to be at the top of your mind as a place you go to get the data you need to compare with your model. We want to present that data in a format which is useful for you so you can do a comparison with it. If the way that CUs is presenting the data in a format or a way that isn't useful to you as a modeler, give us that feedback, because we're not addressing all of our goals. So we want to make more observations available, engaging with modeling groups, trying to help them by making data available in formats appropriate for modelers. On the flip side, we're always trying to expand data sets within our catalog. So one of the things we're trying to do is figure out what would it mean to put a model data product into our catalog so that either us or another partner could develop a data product, a visualization, or a web app that maybe would integrate a model output with some observational data set. There's been some interesting work in terms of our data sets are not complete. They're not measuring all parts of the ocean at all times. So maybe there's a way of integrating observational data with some model product, or looking at model-to-model comparisons, or work with the UN Decade of Ocean Science and some of their initiatives. And I'll just say a shout out to the Digital Twins of the Ocean initiative, which some people with CUS have been involved with, trying to figure out what those questions are. So here's the value proposition associated with CUS. Is what we want to do is we're trying to improve the access and visibility to high quality observation and model ocean data information. We're trying to be a hub for collaboration and coordination. We know that lots of groups have model data, and the presumption is the reason you create models and you run models is because you want that data to be used. But that doesn't always mean that the same skills that are needed to run the model are the same skills that needed to distribute that data or put it into the file format that's needed for a downstream purpose. So CUS is trying to insert itself in and say, well, we've got some capacity to try and help with that. Why? We want to contribute to evidence-based decision-making in the ocean domain. Model data as a data product is definitely part of that. And we're trying to just move forward the whole Canadian community. So the idea of CUS, model data, and more broadly, is what we're trying to do is become not a repository is a poor word, but a place to go to seek or point to high quality coastal and ocean data, facilitate its discovery, access, and visualization. Really trying to make it so that you've got some connection, so your discovery can be discovered regionally, nationally, or potentially internationally as we interface with other USAs. We want some management of that ocean data. A lot of people in CUs really care about metadata and standards for that data. It's not sufficient that it's a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet, but we want to know the data about the data. Not everybody loves that. We've got a lot of people in CUs who care about that passionately. And of course, the payoffs is to do science, is to do innovation, to do sustainable development, whether or not that be fisheries or navigation or search and rescue, transportation, climate change, right? These are all sort of impacts of why we would do stuff. A lot of CUs try to be around fairly open products, so we want to be fairly transparent in what we do, but there are side initiatives that are working with data which have to have some sort of limitations on how freely they can be shared. So anyways, I just wanted to share that CUs is getting into the business of model data. I've got a few models that we've picked as pilot projects, but if you are interested in either using observational data with your model, or you've got a model that you think is producing a data product and you're going, well, how am I ever going to get this out to the world? Come talk to me, because model data is coming under the umbrella of CUs. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation, James. We have time for a few questions. Does anyone want to ask? I don't see any hands. I've been involved with NERACUS for a number of years, so I'm glad you mentioned that. We're probably the Canadian component with about 20 other people, 20 other groups in New England, northeastern US. But it's kind of a neighboring group to the Atlantic CMOS that you had on one of your slides.
Yeah, so there hasn't been in Canada sort of an organization that has brought all these groups together. And so the data is siloed into individual organizations. And one of those large organizations would be the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, right? They've got a lot of data. And so they're a major partner and major funder of this work.
Well, there's one question in the chat.
Oh, I'm not seeing the chat.
I'm not seeing it, so please go ahead. Who is that?
From Christoph, I think.
I can ask a question.
Yes, please.
Sure.
I was just wondering, this is a little bit off topic because it doesn't necessarily concern models, but CIUs in general. Is there a plan to integrate existing databases like BIO's Ocean Data Inventory? Like, will it be easier, for example, to access AZMP data through CIUs? That would be from a modeling perspective.
I'm going to say yes, there is a plan. What I can't tell you is how far along that plan is. So there are various, like DFO, we have representation on lots of different CUs committees in terms of doing that. And there's definitely some of the data which has been hosted by DFO historically hasn't always been the easiest to actually get at, right? There's other interface, like not all, I'm not sure about the AZMP data set, but I know other data sets have required emailing a person in DFO to be able to get it. And we're like, there's better interfaces for that. So I'd have to contact some of the CUs to find out the state of that particular data set. But in principle, the answer is yes.
And what kind of time frame are we talking about? If I may, when is CIUs supposed to be complete with sort of all these data integrated, if that's ever the plan?
We're into what we're calling phase 3, so year 3 of this, and ingesting more data sets all the time. Some of our I don't know. I don't want to speak for a particular person whose job it is to integrate the DFO. 2 years, I would say it's sort of a this phase kind of thing. I think that's reasonable. But again, I don't control the funding on whose job it is to actually make that conversation happen.
So James, if I could ask, what's sort of the mechanism behind CMOS? Is there government departments that are funding this, or how is this done?
Yeah. So the funding from CUs is primarily from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and a grant through MEOPAR, and then the Tula Foundation on the West Coast also supports our work. And we're on sort of 18-month, 24-month funding to bring organizations together. CUS National is a very thin group. I think there's one staff person as a project manager who's the CUS National. There's a few other regional organizations that a lot of the workers are actually dual assigned between, say, Ocean Networks Canada, and then we'll put some other time on CUS. Yeah, sustained, permanent, ongoing funding is a goal and an objective.
So this is probably disconnected. As you know, DFO has, it used to be called Marine Environmental Data Service in Ottawa.
MEDS is still around.
I don't know if they call themselves MEDS or if they changed their name to.
Oh, MEDS is still there.
SDM or something like that.
Right.
Another acronym. So in the ideal world, you might think about sort of updating MEDS and making it modulate into what you call CMOS.
That's sort of a bit of the discussion, right? So as I said, Fisheries and Oceans Canada is a major partner in terms of getting CUs. So it's and so a lot of that data, we're working with them to try and make that data accessible. I don't know what's going to be branded at the top when you go to a DFO resource versus a CUS resource. There might be a little bit of visual identity that needs to be retained, but in terms of making the data accessible, those people are talking. I see another question in the chat about what kind of domains are planned, global or regional. So the data sets that we're looking at primarily are ones that have a Canadian connection. So regional models, but if there was a Canadian hosted model run at a Canadian modeling group that had a global domain, I would say that would be well within sort of the scope of what we're thinking about.
Okay. For some reason, I seem to have lost my chat box, so I can't see that. Are there any other questions you see there, James?
I don't see any more. No.
If that's the case, I think we're at the end of the session, and we can close the session at this time. I want to thank all the speakers for very interesting presentations, and for the audience for being there and also participating. And if you have further questions or discussions, you can contact me and I'll pass them along, or you can directly contact the speakers. So thank you very much.